Today we're talking about the 1985 film After Hours. I've been meaning to watch it for a while. A Scorsese classic. How many Scorsese have I seen? 10 now. I've seen 10. I mean, living legend. We all know it. Don't need to sing his praises. Honestly, looking at them, I don't know what my favorite is that I've seen. I scroll down and I just see more that I've seen that I'm like, I just saw Silence. And I'm like, I love Silence. Goodfellas, hard to argue against it. Shutter Island was so good. I love King of Comedy. Yeah, too many to count. He's a legend. But today we're talking about one of his lesser talked about ones that I find, After Hours from 1985. And it was just a fun ride. It was surrealist. It was silly. It was funny. It had the classic style and just wit to it that I feel like Scorsese just carries through all of his films. And it was a pretty quick one too. It's 97 minutes long in total. And it was just a good time. So when it's after midnight in New York City, you don't have to look for love, laughter, and trouble. They'll all find you. Wow, what a tagline. And it's true. So, the basic, very, very simple synopsis of the movie is Griffin Dunne plays Paul Hackett, a word processor. In the very first scene, he's just sitting in his office trying to explain how to use a computer to another guy. He's very bland, very boring guy. But then he meets a lady at a coffee shop. She tells him to come over, and then he does. And then a series of unfortunate events occur. It kind of felt like they had references to The Wizard of Oz, and you can kind of just make your own references to Alice in Wonderland with the feel of the movie, because it starts very mundane, overly mundane, which I'm sure was intentional by Martin Scorsese, and then it just devolves into this rabbit hole. It devolves into this alternate world. He's thrown into this Wizard of Oz where everything is more, I don't want to say colorful because it's very dark. It's After Hours. But all the people are more colorful, and it's just a weird cast of characters, and he just wants to go home the entire time. And Griffin Dunne, a Noah Baumbach lookalike, in my opinion. He was great. He just wanted to go home. I feel like he said that line maybe 10 times. And it was really fun. And before I go into spoilers, I think that the classic Scorsese wit, his confidence and his style were just oozing here. The story, it really does not make that much sense. Everything that happens to him are just based on convenience or just inconvenience, really, and just happened circumstances. And everything just correlates and interweaves coincidentally. It's just a nightmare, a silly nightmare of somebody just having this worst night out possible. Just this absolute whirlwind of events in New York City. And a lot of the commentary around the movie is the depiction of New York City, just the craziness that New York City was in the 80s. It depicts that really well, not in a really realistic way, but there's one scene in the trailer where he's explaining to a guy his whole story, and he just sounds crazy. He's like, I went to see this girl, but then, we didn't get along, but then, there was this sculpture, and then I went to this bar, but then I couldn't get into my apartment, and then, I went back and I met the girl again, and then blah, 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 and then this happened. Now I'm being wanted by this girl in this ice cream truck, and, that makes sense, right? Right? But I think what I really, really do admire about this movie is the title is it's just very aptly titled in the way that it is it's a surrealist nightmare that's happening to this guy. These crazy things are happening to him that don't make a lot of sense. And then it's depicting this city, this nightlife, in contrast to the boring, mundane job he has at the very beginning, where it's literally just the most basic stuff. He goes back to his apartment, he's watching TV and doing nothing. And then the contrast to the nightlife, trying to just depict that city nightlife to an exaggerated extent. I think it works really, really well, just the blur of everything. And I really did like that scene where he's recapping everything that happened, because knowing people who've lived in the city and told these stories, and maybe been a part of a few city stories myself, people look back fondly on them, and it's kind of when people want to go for a night out, they don't really necessarily want to have a good time. They just want to have a memorable time. And in the moment, it might have just been like the most catastrophic things happening, like the worst circumstances, the craziness of it. But then you look back and then you're like, oh, yeah, this crazy thing. And it's like a story that you can tell, and you felt like you lived. Even though I'm kind of relating that as my own analysis and my own takeaway from the movie. I mean, the character in the movie is very, I mean, he does want to go home the whole time. He says that a million times, and he's very like just down about his entire circumstances. And okay, from this point on, I will go into spoilers. Somebody does die. Like she does die, and he feels partly responsible. So I guess that's kind of less related to like just, you know, a fun, crazy night out where like these circumstances happen. You don't have a plan. You're just rolling with the punches. But I mean, it did have that feel to it. And I think also I relate it to that feeling because just of the silliness of the movie in general. I mean, like, yeah, the cast of characters are very silly. We have the woman who is into bondage and is making these paper mache plasters. Why does everybody in New York start on these paper mache plasters? Makes no sense. You have this crazy Catherine O'Hara ice cream truck lady who meets him, and then because he just wants to go home and not hang out with her, she starts to call him the burglar that is going around the city that week and puts up posters and tries to hunt him down. And then he meets this old woman who is also into paper mache, and she hides him in one of his paper mache molds, and then he's stuck there and he's just watching. And I think that was really cool too. I think, like, again, it is super silly, doesn't make any sense. He's in this basement of this club where this old woman lives, and she has a paper mache room, and he pulls a rope and glue just falls on him. That makes absolutely no sense when you think about it logically. And then to hide him from the people who are after him, she puts him into the paper mache mold, and he's just sitting there completely covered in this paper mache suit. And if I'm trying to relate that just to like the general experience, the rabbit hole of just a crazy night out in the city, that's kind of the point where it's like maybe you've drank too much, taken some drugs, and then you're kind of just the third person viewer of the whole time. He couldn't move. He was completely just watching, and then just whatever happens to you at that point, you're just like in the vehicle that is your body, just watching the things go past you. And then eventually it's morning again. And the ending of this movie is very interesting because it's hard to tell what the takeaway is. I mean, it definitely is just about the night, about the craziness, the surrealist things that is happening. He gets knocked out of the truck. So he's taken in his plastered form because they think it's an art piece. And then he falls out of it just randomly, right in front of his work. He just like breaks out of his cocoon pretty much. He's a new person. Then he goes into his work. And then he just sits down. And then that's the end of the movie. It's like, is he a new person? What did he learn? What are the takeaways here? He didn't even go home. Maybe the work is his home. People are living for their work. That is their home. They're stuck into their 9 to 5. And then the nights are when you let your personality go crazy. And this normal, mundane guy, he doesn't really do that. He's never done that before. And this one time that he tries to go out with a girl and shoot his shot, you know, all this craziness happens to him. He's just not used to it. He's the fish out of water. He's the normal, mundane guy that's usually abiding by the 9 to 5 boring life. But then he goes out of his comfort zone. So many of the small circumstantial things that happen to him, like when he's hiding from the ice cream truck mob and he climbed up a ladder onto somebody's balcony, and then he looks into somebody's room and a woman is just shooting up a guy, and he says, I'm probably gonna get blamed for that. That was great. Love that. That was great. Oh. It's like that's one of those one-liners that you would hear in like an MCU movie, but Martin just makes it work. He makes it work. And I think I'm trying to think if there's any other like little moments that I just want to highlight. Oh, I love the bartender just kicking at his cash register, trying to get him the cash for him to go home. Then he ends up being the boyfriend of her, the girl who died. And then we got, when he was near the beginning, he was trying to get on the subway and they raised the fare conveniently just at midnight. And it's just past midnight. And they have a security guy on the subway. He didn't even want to take that was the train I was getting. But I didn't want to take the subway anyway. Whatever. So many good moments. So many good moments. But yeah, the last thing I want to say, really about the movie is like the style was just, it was just fun. It was just a good time. I think there's some classic shots that you can think of in Scorsese's filmography, like in Goodfellas. You know, you're going through this bar, and then you land. I think it was on Ray Liotta, and it's like that dramatic push-in. I feel like I noticed that a couple times in this movie. You know, there was one time where, yeah, I think it's in this very scene that's in the banner here, and you have the two characters. They're sitting on the bed, and the phone is ringing because he'd picked it up previously, and it was the boyfriend. The phone's ringing. They're both just sitting there, and then the camera is just like panning into them. They're both not saying anything. They're not picking up the phone. They're just waiting for it to stop ringing, and they're just sitting there. And that pan in, and it just happened at like these select moments. And there's just the camera work was great, and I also want to highlight the initial taxi ride that he takes to get to Soho, to get to her apartment. The taxi going absolutely insanely fast. And that taxi driver was great, you know. He lost his money in the wind, couldn't pay him, but then he gets his payback later. But that taxi ride is just going down the rabbit hole, entering Wonderland that is the after hours of New York. And yeah, that taxi scene was just, it was awesome. There's a lot of great scenes. I don't want to say it's like a lot to read into, but there's a lot of references that you can make with this movie. And there's a lot of like, the structure is it's loose, but a lot of things that happen to him can be thought of in terms of like relating it to other media. You know, Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz, Wizard of Oz is directly referenced. Oh yeah, when Wizard of Oz was directly referenced, that was very funny as well. She's explaining that her ex-lover, or her husband, she broke it off with him because he was overly obsessed with the Wizard of Oz. And every time that they made love and he was finishing, he would say, "Surrender, Dorothy." And that's why she broke up with him. She couldn't take it. And yeah, that conversation when they leave the apartment and they go into that diner, that conversation felt so Scorsese. That felt so Scorsese when she was explaining all that. I feel like Scorsese is like defined by his like dinner scenes. People are eating and they're just talking to each other, and it's just like these random conversations, and he's great. His dialogue's so good. This movie, it was so fun. We get to know the locations of the movie. We have the apartment where all the paper mache is going on. We have the bar. We have the diner. We have the club. And yeah, it's just the underbelly of the after hours. What people do after their Monday 9 to 5. I would have loved maybe if like he gets dropped off at his work at the beginning of the movie, and then he sees the various people that he saw throughout the night just like go to their 9 to 5s, just like dressed up in regular clothes. Oh, and last thing I'll say, when he went to the bar after a bunch of things happened, where the bartender was like, "Oh, I just realized my girlfriend just died," and then the bartender's saying that to him, and then there's these two guys that are just making out right beside him. And then the main guy's like, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." And then one of them stops making out and they look over and it's like, "Oh, it couldn't possibly be your fault. You know, you don't have nothing to worry about." And then they just go back to making out. It was just so funny. It was great. But yeah, it was a fun time, crazy time, after hours. Been meaning to watch it for a while. Very glad I did. Yeah. Good time all around.